You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
My name is Greg Jackson. I'm a PhD-holding historian, a professor, and the creator of History That Doesn't Suck, a podcast that makes legit, seriously researched American history come to life through entertaining stories. Join me for a chronological telling of the United States story, from the Revolution to fractious Civil War, tenacious inventors, brave reformers, and more. With more than 100 episodes, you can already binge listen your way from 1776 to the early 20th century. Listen to History That Doesn't Suck on Spotify.
Hey everyone, welcome to the 81st episode of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast. We spent the last couple of episodes bringing Ulysses S. Grant's life story up to speed with the podcast timeline. And where we are on the podcast timeline is November 7th, 1861 and the Battle of Belmont. As we said before, Belmont, Missouri was right across the Mississippi River from the important fortified Confederate position at Columbus, Kentucky.
And to understand just why the Confederates were at Columbus, Kentucky, we need to talk about what all was going on with the Bluegrass State at the beginning of the Civil War. So that's what we're going to do now with this episode, and we'll work our way forward to the Battle of Belmont, which we'll get to next week. But, and this doesn't have anything to do with the Civil War, but I think most of you probably know by now that I'm from Pennsylvania and Tracy is from Arkansas, and then we actually met at school in Kentucky, right in the heart of the Bluegrass. So Kentucky, I think, will always be a bit special for us. And that's where we dated and were engaged and where we were right up until we got married.
And we haven't been back since.
And we haven't been back since then. Nope. All right. So anyway, back to Civil War stuff. We've already mentioned on the podcast about how in the early months of the war, the border states of Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, which remember were all slave states, but in the early months of the Civil War, both the Union and Confederacy hoped that the border states of Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland would side with them. Now, the situation in Maryland was rather quickly settled by its occupation by federal troops.
And y'all already know from past episodes about how the situation in Missouri remained so unsettled and how the state turned into a battleground, but that the Federals managed for the most part to retain control of Missouri. Kentucky, however, provided no small amount of suspense and drama early in the Civil War by teetering between secession and remaining in the Union. And here, as we do every so often, Rich and I want to suggest you actually pull out or pull up a map and find Kentucky. And you'll be able to see right away its key position as a border state between North and South.
When war broke out, Kentucky Governor Beriah Magoffin felt certain that if the Bluegrass State declared allegiance to either belligerent, then it would become a bitterly contested battleground, much like what actually happened to another border state, Missouri. In seeking to avoid that fate, he declared that his state would remain neutral in the conflict. But Kentucky's non-alignment in the middle of a shooting war between North and South was at best a dubious proposition. As one newspaper folksily editorialized, quote, "When the corn is between the millstones, when it is a question of meal or grain, of grinding or not grinding, you cannot be counted out. You must either be meal or corn." End quote.
Since Kentucky was caught between the millstones, and because Kentucky was so strategically vital, neither the Union nor Confederacy really expected the state's neutrality to last. But at the same time, neither wanted to make a move that pushed the Bluegrass State into the other's camp. Besides its key position as a border state between North and South, Kentucky was also rich in resources and manpower, and so it was a prize that each side wanted for itself. And so in the early months of the war, both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis steered a middle course in dealing with their native state. That meant that, for the time being, both presidents found it expedient to respect Kentucky's self-proclaimed neutrality. As the Confederacy struggled to form a nation and an army to defend it, a neutral Kentucky, in effect, provided an impenetrable shield above Tennessee, preventing federal armies from advancing toward the heartland of the Confederacy. And yet, Lincoln believed that to lose the Bluegrass State would be even worse for the Union. He wrote to a friend saying, quote, "I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game. Kentucky gone, we cannot hold Missouri, nor, as I think, Maryland. These all against us, and the job on our hands is too large for us." End quote.
As for Kentucky itself, Kendall Gott, in his book Where the South Lost the Civil War, an analysis of the Fort Henry-Fort Donelson campaign, explains that, quote, "As a whole, the leaders of Kentucky tried to maintain a status of neutrality regardless of political affiliation and in spite of being deeply divided in their sentiments. The pro-Southern governor and the pro-Northern legislature formally proclaimed this policy of neutrality in a joint resolution. Representatives of Kentucky then met with delegates from both governments and received assurances that they would respect the neutrality of the state. Few actually believed that this balance could last long, but for the moment it did keep open warfare from ravaging the countryside." End quote. But Gott goes on to point out that although both the Union and Confederacy respected Kentucky's neutrality, neither state let that get in the way of recruiting men from the Bluegrass State. By midsummer of 1861, Kentucky's Unionists had set up Camp Robinson in the center of the state to drill and train recruits, and the Confederates established Camp Boone about 3 miles across the Tennessee line for the same purpose.
In the first week of August, elections in Kentucky created a decidedly Unionist majority in the State House, and then in another August election, 9 of Kentucky's 10 U.S. congressional seats also went to pro-Union candidates. And so President Lincoln sensed that the tide of popular opinion was in the North's favor. But then at the end of the month, out in St. Louis, Union General John C. Fremont, without consulting the Lincoln administration, issued a proclamation emancipating slaves in Missouri, and Fremont's move caused severe dismay among Kentucky loyalists who valued their slave property just as much as they were devoted to the Union. Abraham Lincoln, aware that Kentucky Unionism was vulnerable, quickly forced Fremont to rescind his proclamation.
What's something you learned in history class that you feel wasn't the whole truth? Better yet, what's something you didn't learn at all that was omitted completely? That's what I'd like to call redacted history. I believe that all history, no matter how good or bad, needs to be told. There are wars, massacres, battles, and entire historical events that are just not in our school's history books. Have you ever heard of Mary Bowser? I didn't think so. My name is Andre White, the host of the Redacted History Podcast, the place where history's forgotten events, heroes, and villains get their story told, one episode at a time. So come huddle around the campfire with me and get ready to hear the stories that you were robbed of. And get comfortable. We're going to be here a while. The Redacted History Podcast. Real history never dies. Stream the Redacted History Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
History never says goodbye. It just says, see you later. Edward Galeano was right when he said that. Events keep happening over and over again in some form. And that's the reason I produced the podcast, My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. What is it? We take stories of history and apply them to the events of today to help you, perhaps, understand them better. We are also part of Airwave Media Network. I've been doing the program since 2006. That's a long time, and the show has a long name. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. Find me wherever you get podcasts.
In the end, though, it was the Confederates who made the move that shattered Kentucky's neutrality once and for all. You see, some Southerners viewed Kentucky's continuous neutrality as a roadblock to Confederate strategic objectives in the West. They were certain it was only a matter of time before the Federals descended the Mississippi and used the river as an avenue of attack to strike Memphis, Tennessee, or even New Orleans. To forestall such a move, some Confederates wanted to act preemptively and move north and seize the high bluffs that dominated the stretch of the Mississippi at Columbus, Kentucky. Columbus was the northern terminus of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, but of even more importance, the bluffs that rose above the river there represented the only high ground immediately adjacent to the Mississippi for 150 miles south, all the way to Memphis, and thus Columbus was the best place for the Confederates to build fortifications and emplace cannon to keep the Yankees from coming down the river. The problem, of course, was that moving north and seizing the high ground at Columbus meant violating Kentucky's neutrality.
Despite the potentially serious repercussions of violating Kentucky's neutrality, one of the most vocal advocates for that course of action was a Tennessean, Gideon Pillow. Pillow had served as a general during the war with Mexico, despite having no qualification for that post other than being a friend of President James Polk. Although his most famous Mexican War exploit was having entrenchments constructed backward, Pillow, for the most part, served well enough in the field, although, for political and personal reasons, he never got on well with either Zachary Taylor or Winfield Scott. After the Mexican War, Pillow returned to Tennessee and busied himself with political activities, including a failed bid for a U.S. Senate seat. When the Civil War broke out, Tennessee Governor Isham Harris made Pillow a major general and named him commander of the state's fledgling army. But then when Tennessee joined the Confederacy in July, Jefferson Davis demoted Pillow to brigadier general and placed Tennessee's soldiers under the command of Leonidas Polk.
In his book, Decision in the Heartland, The Civil War in the West, Stephen Woodworth explains that, quote, political considerations made it inexpedient for Davis to sack Pillow, so he decided to appoint a higher-ranking general to supervise him instead. The general was Leonidas Polk, an Episcopal bishop whom Davis appointed a major general directly from civilian life. Polk had graduated from West Point in 1827 and immediately resigned from the army to pursue a career as an Episcopal priest, never paying any attention to military affairs from that day until the summer of 1861. Davis may have believed that appointing a popular clergyman would garner additional support for the Confederate cause, but he and Polk had been at West Point together, and Davis never got over his profound respect for the older cadet who had gone on to become a bishop. He made the appointment of his old crony in late June, and the bishop general arrived at Memphis, his new headquarters, the following month. End quote. Polk knew that Jefferson Davis, at least for the time being, was committed to a policy that respected Kentucky's neutrality, but upon assuming command, the bishop general found himself swayed by Pillow's arguments in favor of the military benefits of seizing the high ground at Columbus. And so on September 3rd, without notifying Jefferson Davis, Polk sent a force under Pillow up the Mississippi on steamboats to Hickman, Kentucky, just south of their objective, where they landed. They then marched overland to Columbus and seized the town on the bluffs without opposition.
In Richmond, a clueless Jefferson Davis first learned of Polk's seizure of Columbus when he received a frantic telegram from Tennessee Governor Isham Harris. Harris, who had been working hard to woo Kentucky into the Confederacy, was understandably alarmed by Polk's action, as was Jefferson Davis, who immediately ordered Polk to withdraw back to Tennessee. But rather than comply with the orders from Richmond, Polk sent Davis a message saying that as the commander on the spot, he knew what best needed to be done, and claimed that the seizure of Columbus as a defensive position was a military necessity. Davis, probably realizing that the damage had already been done and that he might as well try to make lemonade from the lemons he'd been given, decided to flip-flop and support Polk's action, saying, quote, "The necessity must justify the action," end quote.
Polk blundered in taking Columbus without permission from Richmond, but if he was in for a penny, he might as well have went in for a pound, and also seized Paducah, Kentucky, up the Ohio River, which would have given the Confederates control of the mouth of the Tennessee River, since it's at Paducah that the Tennessee flows into the Ohio, and then just a few miles away, it was at Smithland that the Cumberland River flowed into the Ohio. So by seizing Paducah, Polk would have secured the mouths of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. But Polk didn't seize Paducah, and Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant, the new federal commander at nearby Cairo, Illinois, wasted little time in sending a force to take the place. Grant, recently promoted, had arrived in Cairo to take command of the District of Southeastern Missouri on September 4th, the day after the Confederates occupied Columbus. Responding to that news swiftly and decisively, Grant wrote to the Kentucky legislature stating that the Confederates had entered the Bluegrass State and that he was now forced to respond. Then he loaded 2 regiments onto steamboats and took them up to Paducah, and by the morning of September 6th, the Union soldiers had secured the town. With that move and the occupation of nearby Smithland, Grant had not only seized the mouths of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, but had effectively checkmated Polk's position at Columbus, because if the Federals chose to advance up the 2 rivers, they would, for all intents and purposes, be able to outflank the advanced enemy position over on the Mississippi.
To understand why that would be the case, Rich and I again want to encourage you to pull out your Civil War atlas and trace the paths of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. If you start where they empty into the Ohio River and follow their courses to the south, remember that you'll actually be tracing their paths upstream since both rivers flow from south to north. But anyway, if you follow the path of the Tennessee River, you'll see that a Union force would be able to use it to move south into Tennessee and could, in fact, follow it all the way into northwestern Alabama, where it would cease to be navigable at Muscle Shoals. And then if you follow the course of the Cumberland River, you'll see that a Union force could use it to descend upon Nashville, Tennessee, which was not only the state capital, but also an important manufacturing site and supply depot for the Confederacy. And so of the seizure of Paducah, Stephen Woodworth says, quote, "With that, Grant had virtually canceled all of the military advantage Polk had gained by taking Columbus. This fact, however, was not immediately apparent to very many people, perhaps not even completely clear to Grant himself at the time. No major operations followed immediately on the heels of the Columbus-Paducah episode. Each side continued to raise and drill troops and to consolidate its positions, the Federals at Cairo and Paducah, and the Confederates at Columbus, where Polk focused all available resources to create a powerful fortress." End quote.
Although no major military operations immediately followed the Columbus-Paducah episode, there were significant developments on the political front as Kentucky abandoned its neutrality and moved to side with the Union. The Kentucky legislature demonstrated which way it leaned by urging Governor Magoffin to order Confederate troops out of the state, but it refused to demand the same of federal troops. When the legislators passed this resolution over Magoffin's veto, the governor was forced to comply. But Confederate officials refused to honor Magoffin's request. Leonidas Polk responded by listing all of the Yankees' transgressions of Kentucky's neutrality. And, as has already been pointed out, when all was said and done, Jefferson Davis chose to endorse Polk's action in seizing Columbus. After Albert Sidney Johnston takes command of Confederate forces in the West and establishes his headquarters at Bowling Green in southern Kentucky, pro-Confederate Kentuckians, embarrassed by their state's refusal to leave the Union, will meet in nearby Russellville and establish a so-called Provisional Government of Kentucky. It's through that body that Kentucky will be admitted into the Confederate States of America in December 1861. That spurious shadow government never replaced the elected state officials in the state capital of Frankfort, but its existence does explain why Kentucky, like Missouri, had a star on the Confederate flag, even though the state never actually seceded.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. Our recommendation this time is Decision in the Heartland, The Civil War in the West by Stephen E. Woodworth.
With Decision in the Heartland, Woodworth gives us a succinct, clearly written account of the Civil War's Western campaigns. Using just enough detail to bring clarity to events, he manages to craft a comprehensive narrative of what took place in the crucial Western theater of the war.
As always, you can find all of our book recommendations at the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.blogspot.com.
Okay, and so then a couple of things we wanted to mention before we wrap up this episode. First of all, as of the recording of this show, the podcast is sitting at 599 likes on Facebook. So if you want to be number 600, head over there and like us. And if you are number 600, we just may give you a shout out next week.
And then Rich and I want to thank y'all again for some great 5-star reviews recently on iTunes. Those have been wonderful.
And then big thank yous to Tomas C. in London and Benjamin H. in Australia for their donations. Thanks, guys.
And just a reminder that the level music you hear at the beginning and end of every episode is from the song Midnight on the Water, and it's used with the permission of Spiritwood Music. You can find Midnight on the Water and other great songs by Spiritwood Music on iTunes and Amazon.com.
So this was a shorter episode, but we warned you that might happen a few times this summer. We'll try to make it up to you guys next week when we look at the Battle of Belmont. But anyway, thanks for listening to this episode of the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a history podcast. Tracy and I do hope you'll join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.